This is Greg Canty here, and welcome to the Win Happy podcast. Stay tuned for interesting chats with interesting people about winning their lives and being happy at the same time. This show has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. Thanks for listening. On today's podcast, I chat with speaker, author and podcast host John R.Miles about his life and career and his new book, Passion Struck. John's career took an unexpected turn when this high-ranking military man suddenly found himself reinventing himself as a management consultant. He chats about new leadership models, the move from command and control to coaching and mentorship, and how people need to get strong again. Caught in a rut, John moved from being stuck to what he calls being passion struck. And he wants the same for you, to believe that you can craft an ideal life following the principles in his new book. Let's hear from John. John R.Miles, a huge welcome to the Win Happy podcast. How are you doing?
I am so good, Greg. Thank you for having me here. It's such an honor to be here. I love the folks in Ireland, and I have some huge fans over there, so I appreciate you having me on your show.
Oh, you're so welcome. And I love your subject matter. And the essence of the Win Happy podcast is all about people making choices in their lives along the way and steering who they are and what they do towards things that will, one, make them happy, but maybe you can win at the same time. Even better. I see a lot of people chasing dreams that aren't making them very happy, and sometimes, the opposite can happen. I know you're a speaker and an author. I know you have your own podcast, and we're here today to talk about your new book, Passion Struck. And I swear to God, that's at the core of everything that I do and everything that I talk about. Within our own company, Fusion Communications, our ethos is Win Happy, and we have a bunch of values that we talk to our team about, and passion is one of them. Making sure that you bring your passion with you, and being honest, if you end up punching in time where you're not using your passion and embracing it and letting that flow, that for me is an expensive life. It's a life not worth living. So you've a really, really clever book and a great podcast. But what I'd like to do before we talk about that specifically, I'd like the listener to get to know you so that when we start talking about this fantastic book, Passion Struck, they've got a good sense of where that came from and what your background was. So my very first question is, where did you come from?
I was born in Rochester, New York. My father at the time worked for Xerox. That said, he was a Marine Corps veteran, and so that was very much a part of my upbringing, was that military background, and ended up, I guess, lighting a fire in me to also eventually serve. But from there, because he was in sales, we ended up moving quite a bit, and we matriculated to Cleveland, then to Chicago, and then I spent about 9 years growing up in South Central Pennsylvania. So that was the cornerstone of my upbringing.
Yeah. And what did your mom do?
I was very fortunate during those formative years. She was a stay-at-home mom, and I had a younger brother and sister, so it was great for her to be there to give us that support. After I graduated high school, she went on to have a long career working for the Tennessee Aquarium.
I think, John, growing up, life was quite different for us compared to the current generation. Because like you, when I came home, Mum was there, the dinners and the chit-chat and everything else. And of course, life today and the life that we're chatting about and the context of your book is very fast-paced, and a lot of people don't have those initial supports and everything else. It's a competitive world for the man and the woman, or, the two partners, whatever that looks like. It's a very, very different world. I know my mum being there was really important to me, and I think it gave me a good solid foundation, and it was a good little safety net, a good little filter for getting rid of the day's stresses and whatever was going on in school and everything else.
The thing I really wish we had more of is it just felt so safe back in those days. And I remember my mom, after we finished our schoolwork, would just say, go out and explore, be with your friends, play sports, come back around dusk, and we would eat. And it was just such an opportunity to have freedom in our lives and to cultivate the creativity or interest or whatever you had. And I just watch kids in the neighborhood today, and I remember growing up, you would see kids everywhere in the streets or in front yards, backyards, playing sports, goofing off, and you just don't see it anymore. And I think digital technology has created this fake universe for so many people where they're exploring these things online instead of that face-to-face human interaction that I think was so informative as we were growing up.
Yeah, I was listening to that exact conversation on a podcast, and the point they were making was that as young kids, you went out, you went with your buddies. Sometimes there might have been a group and they turned on you, or there was little fights, or they included you. But as a kid, you navigated all of that. You made friends, you were in teams, you lost friends, you had fights, you made up. There's a lot of socializing going on. There's a lot of just figuring things out, which I think was really, really important. Just such an important thing to do. And we figured that out, and you're not going to do that PlayStation or whatever. It's just not going to happen. And of course, the parents are petrified now. You know, where the kids going, you know, we need to mind them. And cheekers, we came back when we were hungry. Tell me the conversation around the kitchen table when you were young. What typically would the conversation have been?
I think my parents always had high expectations for all three of us. And so a lot of it did focus on coursework and grades and those types of things. As I got older, it could have amounted into activities that we were part of. But I think a lot of it was trying to instill conservative values into us. I grew up in a very Roman Catholic family at that time, went to parochial school, and so much of my upbringing was being raised in the traditions of the church and of having grandparents who were also believers in high achievement. So I really felt that thrust that when I was leading my own life, needed to do it with extreme purpose, to wanting to do something great to impact the world. So that was a big portion of what we talked about. But we also were a family who loved sports, especially the University of Michigan. And my dad is from Detroit. So any sport that was Detroit related, he loved, and especially a fan of football and hockey. So those also dominated kitchen discussions when those sports were being played.
Did you play a lot of sports?
I did. From as early as I can remember, I was playing sports. Primarily, when I was younger, I played a lot of soccer. I always wanted to be a hockey player, but for whatever reason, my parents would never allow me to. And so when my brother, who's 6 years younger than me, got the opportunity and he didn't even really care for hockey, I was pretty upset.
And tell me, the young John Miles, when you're sitting in the classroom and for whatever reason the teacher has lost your attention, where does your head go?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, Greg, about my childhood is people may be familiar with Jim Quick, who wrote the book Limitless, and he often refers to himself as the boy with the broken brain. And I interviewed Jim not too long ago, and as we were starting our conversation, I said to him, Jim, I can actually relate to you because I went through my own incident when I was young that caused me to have a broken brain. And this happened when I was 5 or 6 years old. We were living in Ohio at the time and was playing with some kids tag, and one of them went to tag me, pushed me a little bit too hard, and I went flying in the air, and my head crashed through the basement window. And unfortunately, it resulted in a traumatic brain injury, and it caused me to have different auditory and visual processing disorders. I started getting migraines and also had a lot of issues with cognition and memory issues. So I just want to give that background, because when I was sitting there in class, I was often ruminating over. It was difficult for me to get called on because I would often lose thoughts. And so oftentimes, if my mind would drift, it would be trying to think about what the teacher might call me about, so that I could try to mentally prepare myself, so that if I did talk, I had a speech impediment, so I wasn't stuttering or doing something else and trying to get it out, because it really caused a lot of self-confidence issues with me at a young age.
Okay, so whatever would have come easily to one of your classmates, to you it would have been super pressure, so you had to be super attentive and super focused all of the time. Is that what I'm understanding from you?
I would daydream as well. And I think if you caught me daydreaming at that point in my life, I wanted to be a professional athlete. I most imagined myself as a professional hockey player, but those were some of where some of my dreams took me. I think at that point in time, I had gone to a number of, I guess you could say, it was airfares where you got to see military aircraft. And so I was also very interested in the potential of being a pilot or maybe an astronaut. So those were the things that were big on my mind.
Okay, wow, exciting. So what was your career path? Tell me.
From as early as I can remember, leadership always fascinated me. And it's something that as early as I could, I would try to put myself in positions where I could experiment with leadership, whether that was, I got a paper out when I was in 5th or 6th grade, and having the leadership of self, getting myself out there to do the route, regardless of the conditions, etc. To at 14, I started working as early as I possibly could, and then volunteered for just different leadership opportunities at the grocery store that I was working at. And then in high school sports, became the team captain, etc. But that desire to be a leader really influenced my path into where I went to university. And I had gotten into a number of your typical types of universities, but I also had this desire to serve, and I applied for the Naval Academy and was fortunate enough to get accepted. And so when that acceptance letter came in, although I think initially it upset my father, especially because he wanted me to go to the University of Michigan, which is where he graduated. I just felt that at points in life, we have these choices that we need to make. And for me, if I really wanted to be a leader and to learn that acumen, then there was no better path for me to do it than to go to the Naval Academy and then go into the military after that. So I thought that that was going to be my career path when I was at that point in my life.
I have a few things in common with you. I also had a newspaper route. A little corner shop closed down, you know, the way the big supermarkets take over everything. So this little corner shop closed down, and my dad, spotting the opportunity, gave me a boot in the backside. I knocked on the door of our neighbours who worked with the local newspaper. So instead of the newspapers being delivered to the corner shop, they came to our house. So we didn't actually work for a shop, it was my own business. But I agree with you, that gives you that leadership, that responsibility. You know, you can't be a lazy kid. Even during the summer, it was toughest when you didn't have to go to school, so you had to be up and everything else. The other little thing I was going to say that I have in common with you is my father served in the American Army for 2 years. They emigrated in the 50s, and part of the visa process or whatever, if you were called upon, you had to go. But that wasn't punishment for him. He loved the idea of the military. He was a man into a lot of fitness. So he embraced that, and he did the 2 years. He was on the tour behind Elvis. So wherever they were going, he was on the tour, just to put it into perspective in terms of timing. As a kid, you know, you're using the word leadership. Who did you see as being a leader, and who got you thinking about that idea of leaders and leadership?
I think initially it was my maternal grandfather. He had had a very long career with Kraft, and he was in their research department, but he would talk to me about leadership. He was in the 11th Airborne when he was in the Army, and talked about the importance of leadership and how even in this research area that he was in, how important it was both to be a leader of others, but also to lead yourself. Because he always instilled in me that you can't lead someone else if you're not self-led. And so I learned a lot of principles of him. And one of the things I really saw was the self-discipline that he had, of how there were certain things that were important to him, such as his workout routine. He loved to read. He loved to discover new things. And so I think he instilled a lot of those things in me. And then I would also say my father really introduced me to grit and resilience. And I think even to this day, he's now older. Thank God he's still alive. But I thought he was the toughest SOB I'd ever met in my life. I remember as a young kid one time, he had a drill out, and somehow it slipped and he drilled right through his hand. And I remember there weren't any tears, there weren't anything like that. He just held his hand, said, "Hey, tell mom I'm going to be at the emergency room," and off he went. I can't remember a time in my entire life that I've seen my father shed a tear or be anything but this. I think of him as like General Patton type of figure.
Was he your hero?
I would say it was probably more my grandfather who was my hero, although my father has done a tremendous amount of things for me. I think in those formative years, I probably looked up more to my grandfather.
Yeah. What was his name?
Donald.
Donald. And he obviously served, and he was in combat and everything else, was he?
No, he actually had a really interesting event happen to him. So they were about ready to deploy. He had done all the workups to go, and a week or two beforehand, he gets summoned into his commanding officer's office, and the commanding officer said, "I have no idea what's going on, but the Secretary of War has issued orders for you to report to Fort Detrick." And he had no idea. He was really upset because he had trained with his men. He was an officer. He wanted to go and fight, and he ended up going to Fort Detrick. And for the first 2 or 3 weeks he was there, he didn't even report to anywhere. He reported to the hospital, where they kept giving him tests and different inoculations. And about a month into it, he went to the base and met his college professor from the University of Michigan. He was a chemistry major who was one of the lead people who was doing chemical and biological warfare for the United States. And he got, I guess, selected to be part of that. So that was where he spent the majority of World War II, was at Fort Detrick doing different biological and chemical type of warfare research.
Okay, that sounds really interesting. In an Irish context, we probably struggle with that idea of military service. Whereas I know in the United States, that's a big part of life for a lot of people. And you hear it, thank you for your service. Any military personnel in the States, they're revered most of the time. I know there was a spell during Vietnam when that wasn't quite the case, and it all got very, very scrambled. For you serving, what was that all about?
I think I just always had this desire that I wanted to lead men and women into battle, and I wanted to do my part to serve the country. And so it was just something that I thought was an honor. And you mentioned that people feel that way in the States, but it's still only 2% of the population ever serves in the military. So it's really a small component overall. But I just felt this burning desire that I wanted to have the honor of serving and to put myself into uncomfortable situations where I was going to have to learn and grow from them. So that was a lot of what it meant, both personally, but in my leadership as well.
How long did you serve, John?
I ended up serving a total of about 9 years. And I got out not necessarily because I wanted to leave the military, but my last tour of duty, I was stationed at the Counter Drug Task Force, known as GATF South. And on that task force, we had representatives from the FBI, DEA, Customs, CIA, et cetera. And all of them encouraged me to take a path and to apply. So I applied to a number of them, got into all of them, but made the decision that I was going to become an FBI agent. And I thought that was going to be the career. And sometimes life throws you curveballs. And just like our Congress can't get their act together right now with creating a budget, the same thing was happening at that time. And so my class, literally 48 hours beforehand, gets canceled and recycled. And so I'm thrust into a position where I had no plan B. And I had a wife at the time and needed to provide. And so I did the only thing I thought I could do. I couldn't go back in the military at that point. I had just gotten out. So I called up the Naval Academy and found out that there was this resource book that they had, which was about 1,000 pages long and had the names in it and phone numbers and addresses of every living service academy grad from all the different academies. And then I just went in there and I just started cold calling and cold writing and individuals until I found myself with 2 or 3 job opportunities. And I remember at that time, one was I would have been hired by Honda to be a manager on one of their assembly lines. Another one was I would have been an information tester for one of the major telecommunications companies, WorldCom, who doesn't exist anymore. So thank God I didn't pick that one. And then the last one was the opportunity to get into management consulting by joining Booz Allen. And when I looked at the 3 and what they presented, I just thought coming out of the military, being a management consultant provided me the best opportunity to kind of get my feet underneath me, but to also learn a lot about the business world, much more than I would have in the other 2 positions. And so it was really an unintentional evolution out of a necessity that got me into that career path.
And tell me your military career, all 9 years of it. What did you experience?
Yeah, I had a fantastic military career. When I was at the academy, I really wanted to be a Navy SEAL. And unfortunately, I played rugby, huge sport in Ireland. Loved the team in Limerick. So
we should have done better last year in the World Cup. I think anyway, we just got a little bit too excited. And when it got super serious, it was just a little bit frantic and we lost a bit of ground. And then by the time we had calmed down into the game, it was just a little bit too late. So we just lost our way a little bit. I lived very close to a rugby club where I grew up. I never played it. I thought that looks a little bit too rough. I was a bit like yourself, a soccer player.
Well, I ended up playing winger and fullback when I was in college, but I had mentioned that previous head injury when I was younger, and I ended up getting a couple pretty severe concussions, both of them knocking me out. And as a result, I was having post-concussion syndrome symptoms, and so they wouldn't permit me to take that billet and go to the SEAL team. So I ended up accepting a position working for the National Security Agency and the Navy element that supported them. And it turned out to be everything I could have possibly ever hoped for. My first tour of duty, I got stationed in Spain. It was just incredible. I was what they called a direct support officer. And so you would go out on these specialized short duration missions, and they could be on anything. It could be an aircraft carrier, submarines, different ships. And so I got a whole bunch of fun doing that. And then while I was there, it just so happened that the NSA was looking to start a cadre of men who would start supporting Navy SEAL teams by giving them intelligence overhead support and embedding with them. And I put my name in the ring for it. I ended up getting selected, and it just so happened in Spain we had Naval Special Warfare Unit 10, and so I was reassigned to that command and got to spend a tour building out, which is now a whole expeditionary force for the NSA, that we would insert with the SEAL team. So that was really rewarding. And then from there, went to NSA, from there down to Key West, Florida, where I was part of that task force and got to do some more work with the SEALs down in South America while I was part of that, and then spent a few years in the reserves. So that was pretty much the career.
Did it change you?
I think it definitely changed me. I experienced combat both in Croatia and Yugoslavia, and then later in Iraq. And even when we were doing the counter-drug type of operations, you were going against a pretty lethal force, which was the kingpins, the drug cartels. And so, I mean, it made you see adversity in a different way. It made you look at anxiety in a different way. And leading in those high-stress situations was completely different than, I guess it would be like a competitive athlete. There's a lot of difference when you're a rugby player carrying the ball and you have to make a decision with it than you are in a normal heartbeat of life.
I guess we don't really know ourselves until you're put in those extreme pressure situations. And which way are you going to be? Are you going to be, okay, I'm out of here? Or, yeah, are you the courageous one? Is that something that's trained, or is that something that's in you?
So I think it's both. I think you can, and it's something I have in my upcoming book on learning to be in the zone of optimal anxiety. So I think it's definitely like a muscle that can be trained, but some of it is also, I think, inherently inside of you. You have people who either run to danger, or you have people who inherently run away from danger. But even with that, I think the more training you go through, just as similar to if you were wanting to be a keynote speaker, the more practice, the more rounds, the more evolutions that you do at perfecting that skill, the better you're going to get. The same thing, I think, being a soldier, because you're trained to be put into these heightened situations. And so I think it helps giving you that foundation over time that you're more prepared. But that said, the first time you hear gunshots or RPGs exploding around you, I mean, the reality is far different than any simulation you could possibly ever go into.
I'm thinking now with some of the coverage that we would have seen from some of those school shootings. There was a lot of coverage with one particular team where there was a mass shooter and the trained police or whatever, the security guys, and you could see they just backed off. And to a Joe Public, to an ordinary citizen, you look at those situations thinking, okay, maybe you were petrified. And that stopped you doing from what you were paid to do or what you were supposed to do. I imagine you can be trained for those situations all day and all night, but it's only when it becomes real that you can actually even judge the behavior of people at that time. When you look at something like that, what do you think?
Well, I've seen examples where it's done correctly, and then that one where I still don't know what ended up happening, whether it was a command and control situation where they weren't authorized to go, or if they were truly stuck in the moment. But when you're trying to clear out a school, similar to a lot of the breaches that we had to do going into houses, I mean, it's a difficult thing to do because you're coming into the school and you have no idea what the threat is. So you have to go through and clear every single room on your path before you encounter the threat, which takes time. So, I mean, there's a correct way to do it. And obviously that situation in Texas was one where it was I think it was Texas, where they just were there for an extended period of time, just passively doing nothing in a situation that they should have done more in retrospect.
The last thing about the military experience is, what did you learn, and what did you learn about yourself from that experience?
I think you learn from it that anything is possible. You learn that your capabilities are far greater than you ever imagined they could be. The other thing I really learned through it is that trying times end, and that it's so important to be a perspective harnesser and understanding that we have this ability to look at things not necessarily linear. It doesn't have to be either or, but we can look at it in a different light, that it could be pain but reward. And I think that was one of the things that was most important to me, is I started to see it like a rubber band, that you could flex it. And as I look at adversity that's hit me since that point, I look at it the same way. I mean, yeah, it sucks while you're in it, but if you have the mindset that it's a finite period of time and that you can get through it, it propels you with much more force than being a victim to it.
And in terms of leadership, John, like obviously it is a big difference between running a company where you're worried about sales and production and marketing, to where you're learning how to keep people alive and how to achieve missions that are critical for the country. So in terms of leadership, what are the things that a John Miles will learn that in a lifetime I'll never learn?
I think a huge thing was humility. I mean, I learned right away that as this young officer coming in, I certainly didn't have the answers. And the world of the military, as we were portrayed it to be in an idealistic sense at the Naval Academy, was far different once you got into the fleet. And so one of the things that became readily apparent to me was that my success was ultimately completely aligned with the NCO, or the senior enlisted, who I was working with, and that having that tight bond with them and really listening to them and understanding the guidance that they were giving you was the real deal breaker. Because if you didn't earn their trust, if you didn't earn the trust of the men, I don't care how much leadership you had, if you didn't show them that you were a passionate, humility-driven leader, they weren't going to follow you. And you needed to be one who understood the importance of team and the importance of instilling the philosophy of, no matter what, doing the right thing.
I can imagine working in corporate life and non-military life, and you're recruiting, and the resume comes in front of you, and it's someone with 9 years military experience at the highest level. While you're obviously going to get lots of positives in a particular way, you probably would have a worry that the person you're bringing now is going to be very rigid. They're not flexible. Everything is in the military is yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full sir, orders. And of course you understand why that has to be. But you might have a concern about bringing someone like that into your team. And if I was to say that to you, would I be correct?
Yeah, I think a lot of it depends on what they did in the service. So if you were someone who's in infantry or special warfare or something like that, that could be the case. If you were someone who was in naval intelligence or a different discipline where you're not as much in that tight structure, it could be slightly different. But generally, I guess what I would do in those situations, depending on how soon it was that they got out of the military, was you would typically look for positions in operations or more duties that would be more akin to what they were used to. I think the thing that I struggled with the most coming out, and I'm sure a lot of people did, was learning the disciplines of innovation, creativity. Some of it was emotional intelligence of just because you're taught to not show your emotions. You're taught to try to keep a lot of those things in. So unlearning a lot of that, especially with the upbringing that I had going to parochial school, especially. I mean, it was a lot of rewiring to unwire for me. So I'm sure the same with other people who are getting out, especially if they've been in 20 to 30 years.
Yeah. So as a management consultant in your first few years, how long would you say the unlearning period was that you would, okay, I'm not military now anymore, I'm a management consultant? How long did that eventually take, do you think?
So for me, it was interesting because a lot of the people I was working with were veterans themselves, especially at Booz Allen. And so you still had a lot of the leadership styles governing the company. It was very much a command and control type of infrastructure company. And so in many ways, I still had a lot of that around me, and a lot of our clients were military as well. I think for me, when I made the pivot and went to Arthur Andersen, that was really where the change occurred. And I realized very early on that leading the way that I had been kind of taught to lead in this new environment where the vast majority of people were not military, the whole motivation structure and reward structure is completely different for how you get people to do things. And obviously, the clients that you're working for were much different and had completely different expectations than the military clients I was used to serving, or government agencies, than working for Fortune 500 companies who were very concerned with the pace of business and making dents to the bottom line.
So how did you manage that transition yourself? Was it difficult, or was there a few kind mentors along the way? Did you learn the hard way?
Yeah, a little bit of both. I didn't go in at a low level. I went in at a senior manager level. So I was one step away from being a partner. So I went in at a very top level because I was brought in to become the practice leader for their information security practice. So some of it was just learning by making mistakes. And luckily, I had a mentor who was one of the top partners in the company, Russ Gates, who kind of took me under his wing and kind of helped me evolve as a leader. But in some ways, the military was a strength. In other ways, I felt that I was really behind the curve with some of my peers who were there who had not served, because they had learned a completely different way of leading. Plus, most of them had grown up with the firm, so they had been there 10 years by the time they got a role like I took on. So they had a lot better understanding of how the firm worked, how people led, those interrelationships where I had to come into it cold.
And I know you had a very successful career working your way through with some excellent companies, and observing work and human behavior at that time. And I know there's a passage of time as well, with a decade or two. What have you observed, and what's changed about people?
I hate to say it, but I think what I have observed over the past 2 or 3 decades is that people are a lot softer than when I was growing up. And it's just the whole way that you lead people is just completely different than I was accustomed to. How I was led, how I was told to do things. It was much more authoritative. And now I think you have to do it more in a servant way, where you're much more a coach and a mentor than someone who can just dictate tasks to people. But I also think that people aren't as used to experiencing the pain and adversity that I grew up with, and many people I know grew up with, and it's a harder thing for people to get through. And, Greg, the interesting thing is, if you start looking at the statistics, and this is something not just in the United States, and it's in most Western countries, over the past 40 years, decline in entrepreneurship and people starting new businesses is immense. There's like a 50% decline based on the studies I've looked at. And the craziest thing is that college students and high-skilled individuals who you would think would be the ones who are leading this charge are the ones who are most resistant to do so, because they found they can enter the workforce taking a well-paid job without the risk of having to start their own business or become an entrepreneur. And so I think all these things that made America the fascination of so many people. I remember when I would go to Europe in the 80s and 90s, I think the way that we're viewed is completely different today. And a lot of it in the past had to do with, we were a whole country chasing the American dream, a lot of people wanting to be entrepreneurs, et cetera. And now we are so many people that work in these large corporations. And my biggest fear right now is we're entering an unprecedented period of time where my experience being in these big companies is that they will take whatever the easiest way for them to do so to cut costs. And if that means they can start using robotics, automation, AI, other things to do so, more and more jobs are going to be disrupted. And if you look at what McKinsey and Deloitte and other people are saying, I mean, I read statistics that show over the next 10 years, 300 to 600 million jobs globally. So to me, it's a time when people need to start getting strong again. We need to start realizing that you are going to have to, if not become an entrepreneur, become a solopreneur, because I think we are going to have to understand how to reinvent ourselves at a faster pace than we probably ever have in the history of civilization because of all the change that's hitting us. So I really hope that we start teaching this more and putting the focus on this more. It's something that I tried to bring out in the book on one of the most important steps is being this brand reinventor, because I've had to reinvent myself countless times, and I think it's going to be a discipline that serves these next generations very well.
And that authoritative approach, it was very straightforward. Bang, you just do it. And that was straightforward. It was easy. I just do what I'm told. And the opposite then can leave people in a very uncomfortable position. Don't know quite what to do, and the boss, needs to be very clear, but they're wary about how they how they direct you to do this thing. And sometimes maybe they've told you and you haven't quite picked up exactly what to do. And there's a lot of grey and discomfort and everything else. The other little thing I've kind of found, I was listening to a podcast. It was Pivot, Kara Swisher and Prof. Galloway. And they were talking about the layoffs in a lot of the big companies, the likes of Facebook and Disney and all of this kind of business. And they were saying, yeah, layoffs are good. That's a really good sign that this is a company who are about their shit, they're looking at things. We've too many people. That's a sign of a well-run company. And I'm thinking, that's a bit harsh. Now, some of the conversations about it were, well, it's probably a good lesson for some of these young bucks to pick up because they've never known, a bit of adversity or whatever. So that's good for them. That's good for them. The other thing I think that's changed, it's a bit like the football teams, and your rugby teams. They get signed for big money. They're all treated like superstars. They score a goal, they're kissing the badge, and a year later, they're off to another club for more money and they're kissing a different badge, pretending that this is the only place I've ever wanted to be. That bit of loyalty is gone, and I think that transaction between company and individual, it's like, no one really gives a shit about anyone anymore. The employees just, it's just like production line fodder, and that gets reciprocated then by the workers, so there's no loyalty to anything. Is that kind of the environment that we're talking about? And does that feed into your rationale about, I need to be a solopreneur?
Oh, definitely saw as I got more senior that you were more expendable, especially because of your salary. But I think in general, the companies that I was with, I mean, when you get edicts like we did when I was at Dell, that we had to take $500 million out of the technology budget, there's only so much software cost that you can cut before you have to cut people cost. And when that's happening across multiple areas in a company, the people are both your most important asset, but they're also your biggest cost. So that's where a lot of these companies will have to focus their cost cutting. And so the smart ones, like I've seen Accenture is doing this, where tasks that AI can be used to probably more consistently do a better job than a human, such as some of their analysis of financial statements, they're actually having AI do it, but they're being smart and they're retraining their workforce to do other things, to take those low-hanging fruit things off the table and put them on more important things. Now, I hope more companies will do that, but I guess my message, and the one I tell to my kids, is that one of the biggest skill sets you need to have is to become a constant learner. And the easiest way to do that is to develop the habit of reading. Because let's face it, the only difference between someone who's illiterate and someone who can read is the fact that one person reads and one person doesn't. And it's fascinating to me how many people I meet who, when I ask them when the last time they read a book or anything was, it's been years, or they don't like to read. And I'm someone who reads over 100 books a year. So to me, it has been one of those things that has always allowed me to stay on the cutting edge and to have ideas that I could employ in different areas of my life to get better. And so that constant learning is an extremely important thing, because if you look at all the other species on Earth, I believe we're created to be the ultimate learning machine. That's how our whole DNA is created. And so we need to lean into that and use it as our greatest strength.
So the seeds of your book, Passion Struck, and the podcast and the idea and the framework, when did all that start coming together for you, and the principles behind it?
I guess it first started coming together almost 15 years ago. At that time, it was kind of a whisper that was going on in my head that I was so distracted with everything else in my life, I wasn't really listening to this voice telling me that I was on the wrong path. And it took me a number of years of running into adversities. And I think, to say this another way, I think the universe rewards us, or God rewards us, if you're doing things that are going more towards uniqueness in how you're trying to serve people positively. And I think you start running into more issues in your life, more barriers, when you're living inauthentically. And I think I had reached a point where I was living very inauthentically compared to the person who would be the ideal self I wanted to become. And what ends up happening in self-discrepancy theory is you have your actual self, your ideal self, and your ought self. And the difference is your actual self is who you are, your ought self is who you think you should be, and the ideal self is who you could become. And I had become too much of my ought self because I got stuck with all the burdens that happened to us: rent, car, everything else, family obligations, societal standards once you reach a certain point. And I think it gets harder and harder as you get older and you've got more of these burden of responsibilities to take the risks that it really amounts to if you want to become your ideal self. And so it, to me, was a learning process over time where I really started to craft this ideal life that I wanted. And then it was a couple of situations that put me in the position that I decided to make the leap for it probably 4.5, 5 years ago. And then I started Passion Struck in 2020, and then the podcast in 2021.
Where did the name come from?
So it was not something that was even a phrase I'd even heard before. And I remember I was talking to a mentor of mine, coach of mine, Keith Crotch, who, if people aren't familiar with, Keith started a company called Ariba, sold it to SAP, was the chairman and CEO of a company most people would recognize, DocuSign, and then most recently was the Assistant Secretary of State for the United States. But I was talking to him, and we've been friends for 20, 25 years, and I was telling him that I'd been doing this research over the past, at that point, it was 4 years or so, of these people like himself. And I was trying to figure out what separates, as Robin Sharma would said, the 2 to 5% who create their actualized self versus the rest of us. And I started looking at all kinds of individuals, whether it was professional athletes or astronauts or CEOs, to understand what was the secret formula that enabled some to succeed and so many of us not to pursue ourselves, this ideal life that we want. And it ended up culminating in 12 principles that I kept seeing repeating again and again that all these vanguards employed. And I started testing it against different people, like Bono is someone I feature in the book, to Jeff Bezos, to Hilary Swank. And I kept seeing that they were following this pattern. And so I was talking to Keith about this, and I said, it's as if this like light ignites within, where you go from being stuck in whatever situation you find yourself in to all of a sudden you become this almost super powered human who has found this unique life mission and this problem that only you can solve. And you become so passionate about doing anything to pursue it because of the impact that you see it could make, that you're willing to give up reputation risk, financial risk, even the risk of relationships and everything else to pursue it. And he said to me, John, it sounds like you're talking about someone who went from being stuck to passion struck. And I was like, a light bulb went off. And at that point, I went to GoDaddy and thought, never in a million years would that phrase possibly, that domain possibly be available. And yet it was. And so I think things like that happen to us for a reason. And so it became the movement from that point forward. And I think it represents it beautifully.
Yeah, and I love the image on the front of the book with a fire, because it sounds like people rediscovering the fire that's inside them and that feeling. I use a phrase to describe a situation that I see a lot of people falling into, and I think I've heard it described by you as well. I talk about them being happily pissed off. And what I mean is, there's a lot of things wrong in their life, be it the job or their relationships or even their health and everything else. But they've fallen into habits that they're comfortable with. You go into the same job and you see the same people and you put up with the same bullshit from your boss and you accept that your ideas are never going to be accepted, so you don't even put them forward anymore. But the paycheck is important. You go through the same door at home and you listen to the same stuff and all that kind of thing. You go on the same holidays and meet the same people and do the same things. But there's comfort in all of that. So I talk about it being happily pissed off. So I want to reignite my passion and get going again. I want to use the framework that you give in the book for doing that. And I know you have the framework described in kind of, there's two kind of sections to it. Can you talk about the framework in as much detail as you want to without giving away the secret sauce for the listener?
Yeah, so the framework is based on something that I call the passion struck model. And so there are three core components of this model. It's mindset shifts, behavior shifts, and deliberate or intentional action. And a way for you to think about this, if you were looking at this and you were thinking of Mickey Mouse and the two ears are mindset shifts and behavior shifts, the first step in our journey towards transformation begins in reshaping our mindset. And it's a step that's illuminated by the classic Stoic virtue of wisdom. This passion-driven wisdom paves the way for new actions that enable a foundation for significant change. So what our mindset is, it really allows us to clarify our why, and it influences how we approach challenges and opportunities. The behavior shifts come into play once our mindset has been recalibrated as the next logical progression. And so this is where things like perseverance become extremely important. And it's where the Stoic virtues of values and temperance, you can think of self-mastery, come into play, because this is really where your behavior is, where you're aligning your actions with your core values. And so your behavior really is the how you want to act in pursuit of your goals, and it's driving the what, which is a direct relationship of your mindset. And then lastly, the psychology of progress, as I refer to in the book, which is really taking intentional action, is the where and the when that you align your action with your goals. And in this way, your actions become an integral part of your personal evolution. So that's how the book is really formulated, is telling you how it gives you 6 mindset shifts, 6 behavior shifts. But then the third part is really where this goes from just being a book you read to a book you live, because it shows you how to apply them into your life.
Yeah, is this nearly a manual that you follow and exercises that you take. And I've looked at some of the language in the book, and it's really, really interesting, some of the ideas. And as someone that works in marketing and communications, I love words like the gardener leader. What's a gardener leader?
So we've talked a lot about leadership today, and I've talked about, you asked me for this next generation, what is changing? I think the way that you have to lead today is changing. And I am someone who grew up most of my life kind of following a servant leadership type of model, although I would have said I was a situational leader, because to me, no two people are the same. And so the way that you lead one person in a situation based on if they're an introvert, an extrovert, if they're shy, depending on what their DNA is, you tend to approach them differently when you want to get something done. But this gardener leaders is kind of an overarching framework, and it's really the idea of how do you lead with intention. So think of it as a gardener leader intentionally nurtures their team's growth akin to how a gardener carefully tends to each plant. And it involves, as I was just saying, a deep understanding of each individual's unique talents and potential, coupled, and almost more importantly, with providing the right environment and resources for them to thrive. Another way you can think about this is being eyes on, but hands off, where the leader is informed, they're giving you the necessary tools and training, but they're not micromanaging. And I think this is absolutely critical in this fast-paced, innovation-driven workplace that so many people find ourselves in, because the team members need to have the autonomy to experiment, to take risks, and to develop creative solutions while they still have that support and guidance of their leader, but they don't need that leader to be doing the jobs for them. And so I profiled two people in this chapter. One I already talked about, Keith Crotch. The other was General Stan McChrystal. And a great way to think about this is if Stan was, as he was, the 4-star general over all forces in Afghanistan, he can't be where his special operators are up in the mountains in Afghanistan, expecting to be able to micromanage what they're doing. He needs to be eyes on, understanding that he's set the proper parameters for them to be successful. He's given them the training and tools and instructions to do their job, but he needs to be hands off to understand that they're going to know the situational elements of whatever they're thrown into, and believing that they're going to make the right decisions in those circumstances. So this has 5 pillars that I've come up with to it. One is delegating to the right level. Another one is effectively hiring for your weakness, because gardener leaders understand their limitations and are actively trying to fill the gaps. It's becoming ambitious, which is a blend of humility and ambition, which I think is extremely important for modern leaders. It's putting the team first at all cost. The team's needs and goals always come first, which is, I think, a little bit different from a servant leader. This selfless approach ensures decisions are made for the collective good. And then where this comes into really the passion-struck element is you've got to inspire your colleagues through a noble mission, through a passion-struck mission. And it's really aligning your team around a shared noble mission and getting them clear on that and motivating them to then execute against it. So to me, those are some of the core things that I would like to see more people do as a gardener leader.
And John, as you're describing all of that, I swear to God, the hairs are standing up in the back of my neck, because a lot of what you're describing, we don't see now, and it's just inspirational.
Yeah, I know. I was interviewing Mike Michalowicz, who probably a lot of people know. He wrote the book Profit First, and he's got a new book called All In. And during our conversation, I started to lay out these different principles, and he's like, that's exactly what we need. So I really think with as much remote work and that's happening, outsourced work that's happening, we need a new model for how people are leading, because the servant model is great. I loved it, but I found myself that you had to be too hands-on in how you're really leading the people. And more people today, I think, want to be led hands off.
When you started talking about the gardener, I suddenly thought about that old movie. I'm not sure if you've seen it, Being There, with Peter Sellers.
Oh, yeah, it's been a long time. Yes.
Remember, Chancey Gardner was his character. And again, I'm sure a lot of the listeners do not know this movie, but it was a guy who pretty much grew up in a house in the middle of a built-up city. I presume it was New York, I'm not sure. But he was the gardener, and he was a simple character, and that's the only thing he knew of life. And suddenly the owner of the house died, and he had to leave, so it was the first time he wandered into the world. And he had all of these pearls of wisdom about him. It was the only thing he knew about how things grew. So he quoted everything about the garden, and suddenly he was speaking world leaders about gardening, and you have to nurture the garden and all of that. So it just brought me back to that a little bit. There was another interesting concept and language that you used around mindset shifts, and this is the mosquito auditor. Again, John, I'm thinking, what in the name of God is a mosquito auditor?
So as you're thinking about this life you want to craft, I start with the first step is to become a mission angler. And there's a whole story to that. But the next step is you become a brand reinventor, because after you start recrafting the life that you want, you're going to have to reinvent who you are in order to accomplish it. And I think the first thing that happens when you start doing that is you start running into these invisible influences who start whispering in your ear that the path that you're trying to reinvent yourself on is the wrong path. And so as I was thinking about this and the whole concept of invisible influences, I happened to be on a walk with my dog. I was listening to a radio show, and the announcer came on and said to the audience, call in and tell me what you think the most dangerous animal on the planet is. And I think, like everyone who called in, I had the same things in my mind, whether it was a shark or a snake or a spider or something like that. And it turns out that far and away, the mosquito is the most dangerous animal on the planet. It kills more people in a year than all the sharks altogether will in 100 years. It's astronomical. It's like 1.5 million to 2 million people per year. And yet these things are around us, but we take no notice of them. I mean, they might be a nuisance when we hear them around us, but we typically don't do anything until they bite us, and then we feel the long after effects. And I think the same thing with human mosquitoes that are in our lives. And so I thought it was a great analogy for people to remember this. We often hear that we are or we become what the 5 people who are most closely to us influence us to become. And I think that that's true, but I think it's worn out. So what I wanted people to think about was these people that we're associating ourselves with are either people who are helping us go to the place we want to be, or these pesky human mosquitoes. And I identified 3 types. One is the bloodsucker, who's the very manipulative type, the boundary destroyer, who is constantly out for themselves and is trying to inflict every ounce of, or get every ounce of blood that they can from you for their self-benefit. There's the invisible suffocator, who is the pessimist in your life, who is the doubting John, who's constantly telling you all the reasons why you shouldn't be pursuing becoming the person you want to become. And then there's, whether you call it a piece of work or a PETA, pain in the ass, there's that mosquito who we all can relate to, who we can't seem to get rid of them, and they're a constant nuisance in our life. They're obviously more than this, but I thought keep it simple to 3 so that people could identify them. And what I encourage people to do is to look at this as if they were looking at an archery target. And the simplest thing to do is just go to the first 3 concentric circles, put the 5 closest people to you, maybe if it's in a work setting, who are the 5 closest influences that you have? And are any of them one of those 3 mosquitoes? The beauty of this is if you see that in any of them, and now you know, and you can do something about it. The next step then becomes you have to become a boundary magnifier, which is one of the behaviors I have in the book, and to properly implement these boundaries so that you protect yourself from these influences on the path to where you want to go. So I think that was one of the most fun chapters to write.
Can I say, John, that this book should come with a warning? There should be a big warning on the cover, because if you put your hand out and you grab this book from the shelf or you're placing your online order, it could just change your life. And maybe people aren't ready for that. So can you give people the warning, and who is it absolutely perfect for? Because I'm full sure this is going to change your life. So who should read it, and what should they be prepared for when they start consuming it?
Well, Greg, I appreciate that description very much, and it's very humbling to hear you say that. But in my mind, that's exactly what I was wanting to do. I didn't. There's so many help books out there. There's so many books I read per year that I read them and then they just go on the shelf. And I didn't want it to be that book. I wanted it to be a resource that you could pull out at any time and refer back to it. Like, one of my favorite books I've ever read was The First 90 Days. And every time I go into a new job, I bring out the First 90 Days book and look at what I need to do in the first 90 days. I brought this out because if you want to create an ideal life, I have given you the formula along with exercises on how you can implement it. But the truth is that if you want to be that man in the arena or that person in the arena that we hear about in the famous quote, you have to do the work to become that person in the arena. If you want to 10x your life, if you want to become one of the top 5%, then it comes with hard work and a desire to want to craft your life that way. And so what I tell people is that you can continue on the path that you are, and you can look back. Cornell just did a study on this in 2018, where they examined thousands of people who were looking back on their life, and they asked them, what's their biggest regret? 76% of them said that they didn't pursue their ideal self that they wanted to become. Do you want that to be your legacy, or do you want to have a legacy where you took your shot at creating a passion-struck life? If you're up for that challenge, then read the book and apply it. I wrote it for 4 different groups of people. One are the high achievers who want to achieve these levels. Maybe they're plateaued out and they need some core skill sets that can get them to the next level. I wrote it for the person who is completely stuck and they're burdened by the burdens of life. They're stuck at that point and they see this ideal self, but they don't know how to achieve it. I tell you how to do it. I wrote it for the person who's like my 2 kids, who I dedicated the book to, who are in their early 20s, just coming out of college, and they want the script on how to create an ideal life. And then I wrote it also for professional athletes who are good, but they want the keys to becoming great. And so those are it can benefit more than that, but those are some of the target groups I was looking for.
And if you see your husband or your wife or your partner coming home in the door with the book under their arm, again, be prepared. Look for the changes. You might read the book as well yourself. Maybe read it before they read it. That might be a nice piece of advice. I'm not sure.
My biggest piece of advice would be not try to implement them all at once. The biggest thing that I talk about in the whole book, a core theme, is the power of micro choices. It's these small, tiny choices. Each of us makes 60 to 90,000 of them a day. And over time, they either take us to a valley of despair or to a waterfall of greatness. And it's being consistent on how you are applying them towards your goals, aspirations, and values that determine, are you going to keep making the unintentional, easy choices to do the same thing every single day? Or are you going to start taking the passion-struck, intentional choices that are harder, but they're going to take you to where you want to become? The choice is yours.
What was the biggest, toughest choice you ever made?
I think the toughest choice was coming to the realization that I wasn't doing an adequate job of self-leadership, and that if I wanted to become the person I needed to become, it started and ended with me. And it was the realization that I had become extremely good at creating success and money for other people, but I wasn't creating my own life dream. And I only had one person to blame, and that was myself, for settling instead of pursuing the life that I wanted to live. And once I started applying these principles that I have in the book, everything started to change. And it's one of those things, it's kind of like the opposite of burnout. Either one, you start at a low level and you start building a foundation. And in both of them, over time, it hockey sticks. One into numbness and apathy, the other into self-actualization. So pick your poison.
I suspect, John, people are going to start reading this and they won't be able to go to bed. They're lying in bed and they're twisting and turning. They can't sleep. That this is just too good. I'm absolutely loving it. This is Win Happy, and it's a path towards win happiness. Passion struck. You're on the Win Happy podcast, John. What is happiness to you?
And I think it's the opposite of what I defined it for so many years. To me, I thought happiness was associated with success. I thought it was associated with consumerism and materialism and getting all these titles and everything. And the more I got, the less happy I became. To me, happiness is really the relationships that you forge in your life. It's the positive impact that you make on another human being. It's seeing awe when you see another human being perform an act of kindness to someone else, or yourself feeling that inside. I have always felt more at Christmas when I give gifts to someone than I'm receiving. And the same thing to me happens in your life when you start serving others instead of serving yourself. And it's those things that I think bring contentment, and it's living your life based on intrinsic motivation instead of giving a crap about what people think about you or what society expects you to become. Follow your dreams. And I think that's what leads you to craft the life that you want, and you'll be much happier on that journey.
Yeah, I love that. And you've given me and the listeners the gift of your book and the insights about it today. And winning, at this stage of your life, you've had loads of achievements. What does winning look like at this stage?
And Greg, I think to me, winning is when I get a note from a listener saying that something that I said or a guest that we had changed how they were dealing with a predicament. Or, the biggest winning is someone telling me they were really stuck and I helped give them the courage to make a change. To me, it's the tiniest things that we're having an impact on someone else that shows me we're winning. It's not the downloads. It's not that. It's the fact that we're making a positive difference in one life. And if you can make a difference in one life, I think people don't realize from that one life you've influenced, many other lives are going to be influenced because you've changed that person's life and how they're leading it, and that will propagate. So, and one of the biggest things I've ever learned is that you don't have to change the world. You just have to change another person's life. And from there, it can sprout systemic change everywhere. And I think that's what we need, because, man, we have so many people right now who are feeling beaten, battered, bored, broken, helpless, lonely, whatever it is. And I think it all comes down to so many people feel like they don't matter. And if there's one thing I can try to help people understand, is that you do matter. You are unique. Your life holds significance, and you need to live it to the best that you possibly can, because it's finite.
Thank you for that. I know you're moving me with your words, and I know that's going to inspire so many people. I've one last question for you. It's a biggie, and it's a little bit of a tricky one. What was your best day ever?
It was probably been the birth of my kids. You probably have to go with that. I think I had a real bad combat injury in the military where I was hit by a rocket propelled grenade, and I think it was actually waking up in the hospital. So, and realizing I wasn't dead. But the kids, especially my son, the doctors had to perform an emergency C-section because he was struggling. And so the fact that he was safe and just being there and seeing that life born to me was life altering.
Can you tell me about that day in the hospital and what actually happened?
Well, my ex-wife was in labor for a very long time, 22, 23 hours, and it just turned out that he was a lot bigger than they expected him to be. He was almost 11 pounds. She was all of 5'2", and he just wasn't going down the birth canal, and his umbilical cord had gotten wrapped around him, and he was strangling himself. And so they had to go in and immediately intervene when they saw that his heart rate was dropping and things like that. And for me, it was, you've waited for 9 months and all of a sudden his life is flashing before you. We didn't even know if it was a he or a she at that point because we didn't, but to me, it was absolute panic and horror of the thought of losing him to incredible joy, 5-10 minutes later when he was born.
I have 2 kids. Brendan, my son, and his wife Isla, they have a gorgeous little girl, little Hazel. And my daughter, Ellen, her other half, Mark, Ellen is expecting in a few weeks. So I'm nervous. I must admit. I think it is until everyone gets past that moment and people are delivered safely. You never know. John, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure and an honor. I've learned so much. I'm looking forward to spending a lot of time with your book. I'm nearly nervous. Be careful what you pick up when you start reading because it will change you. Thank you so much.
Well, Greg, thank you. And one thing I did want to say to anyone who's listening in Ireland is thank you so much for your support of me. Ireland is one of the top listening countries for my podcast. And I'm just so thankful that it's having a positive impact.
Yeah, well, I hope they got to know you a little bit better today, John, by hearing your story. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Greg.
Thank you for listening to the When Happy podcast, which has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. If you'd like to get in touch, feel free to send me an email at greg@fusion.ie. So until next time, take it easy.